It's not in the face! Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Hey, Not the Face with your host, John Nash, and your producer, me, Steffi Haynes. And today we have, I'm going to use a term that PFL likes to use and one likes to use. We have a duopoly today. We just have two topics. So we're going to call it the duopoly episode. I know it doesn't make sense, but I like it. John, how the hell are you?
Fairly good. I took my mom to the airport. She headed back to Minnesota. I'm here in LA right now by myself, except for the cat who's forgiven me for bringing my mom out here. I'm trying to clean up the place for visitors in the future. So,
all righty. So, what do you think of my duopoly?
It doesn't make any sense, but I like it.
See, it's just the sound of the word. So what is today's duopoly? Well, we're going to talk about Bryce Mitchell, and we're going to talk about a video that Luke Thomas put out that made some very, very solid points, and we're going to expand a little bit more on that. First things first, though, we got to talk about Bryce Mitchell because that's the hot topic of the day. Now, he put out a video. It's the very first episode of his brand spanking new podcast. It actually aired 5 days ago, but I guess people just found it today. And what happened is that he, at some point, it was about an hour and 20 minutes into the podcast, said that Hitler was a great guy and that he was just out there trying to take care of those, and I quote, greedy Jews, and just went on a spiel about how the Nazis were not bad people and how, Hitler was, I liked him. He was a great guy. So obviously lots of blowback has been happening from that. And the UFC prepared a statement for Dana White. And Dana White came out and he renounced anti-Semitism and things like that. And he took questions from media members in attendance, and it boiled down to the fact that free speech, no punishment. So, John, my first question to you, why do you think UFC declined to punish Bryce Mitchell?
Well, because they're big believers in free speech. They said that. That's the reason. First of all, I want to note that wasn't this a Kids in the Hall skit? You thanked Hitler. Remember that skit?
Yes.
The first one in the Academy Awards, and this is the weird thing too. People are like, "Oh, we're so politically correct today." I got to tell you, as older people compared to most of our audience, back when I was a kid or growing up in the 80s and 90s, if you had said something like this before we invented canceling, you would have been canceled. Hitler was the one guy you can't give credit to. Mm-hmm. You could not say, hey, hats off to Hitler. And apparently that's what Bryce did. So, I think it's the reason they didn't fire him is because they now have a position that anything goes. And I'm sure we'll get into details about why, because we're going to talk about their contracts, I'm sure, and how those work. But right now their position is, as long as you're not saying anything about France Ngannou, because when you talk about France Ngannou, that gets edited out of their material. As long as you're not saying anything about their cost of money, with their directly criticizing their sponsors, or I'm sure talking about, they basically let you say anything. Now you could even probably talk about the antitrust lawsuit, about the pay, but you would not get your discretionary bonuses that they give if you do that. You would not get as good a contracts, as good as fights, so fighters refrain from saying anything about that. But the new UFC position is you can say anything, and especially if you say anything outside the UFC. Now, if he had said that in the cage, that might have been different. But if he says it outside the UFC, they let fighters say anything.
But they typically haven't over the past.
No. I mean, Miguel Torres, someone should call him to apologize to that guy.
Yeah, because he made a rape van joke, not spoken. He did it on social media, and he removed it pretty quickly when he saw blowback from fans. But because somebody had screenshotted it, he got cut from the promotion. And then you have Matt Mitrione, who spoke ill of Fallon Fox. Let's be real here. His suspension was 3 months long. There was 3 months from the time he, had his last fight to the next fight. And somewhere in the first week or so after that last fight, he made the comments about Fallon Fox. So magically, his suspension was 3 months. And the number that was attached to the fine, no one really knows because neither UFC nor Matt Mitrione revealed it.
They also fined Nate Diaz for a comment back then. They canned, or no, they didn't can because he was an independent contractor, but they no longer worked with Stitch Durant because what he said about Reebok. I mean, they have a whole history of this. Now, listen, if you want to say, oh, the UFC shouldn't interfere with people's speech. I mean, I'm not big on the UFC fining independent contractors, things like that. But one thing a business can do, because freedom of speech is basically that the government can't intrude on your speech. And then there's a concept of freedom of speech where you're trying to hold the position that people have the freedom to talk about what they want. And I would say if he was working at the back in a restaurant as a cook or in a factory line and he held these beliefs, I would not be one, even as awful as these beliefs are, I would not say he'd be fired. But the difference is when you're in a position where, as an independent contractor technically an independent contractor working for the UFC, saying horrible things on a podcast that uses your position in the UFC to give you credence and notoriety to be able to say these things, it basically it tarnishes the UFC. And so I can understand, like, we do not want to do business with you because this tarnishes our brand. It's terrible. It's terrible what you said. It's worse than what all those others said. I mean, the Torres situation was, he was also, you could be offended by it, but he was quoting, I think, a joke on TV, so it's, I mean, I think really they just wanted to get rid of Torres at the time, but still. And so in this situation, it's, a broadcaster or the UFC does not want to do business with someone that's going to make them look so bad. I think that's understandable to say we're not going to do business with them, especially even to get into dollars and cents. You're not gaining much by Bryce Mitchell. He's not a massive star. So if you're just trying to be a greedy bastard who's all about dollars and cents, then even then it doesn't make sense. But to get back to the point, they have changed their position from what it used to be. They're now in the position that anything goes.
Let's talk for a second about punishment. I agree with you that I don't like financial punishment. It seemed to me that Matt Mitrione was like a special circumstance kid. Like, he was the one that they used to make a small example of. Like, hey, go along with this, Matt Mitrione, okay? Just say we find you. Let's say we suspend you. But we never heard anything about what it actually was. But what about, say, a suspension, a significant one, at least a year? Would that work out? Do you think that would be acceptable in this scenario?
I mean, personally, for me, even I would be against that because I don't believe the UFC is a real governing body. They're a promotion. I think the thing for the UFC to do is, do you want to be in business with this guy or not? Oh,
I think that he should be gone. But there are people out there. I mean, it has social media divided right now. The MMA sphere, the MMA bubble, the community on social media is very divided on this. I mean, and I know you as well have been playing guacamole, for lack of a better way to describe it.
Well, let me just, the secret of that is you got to remember, you got to block Jake Shields in advance, which I had not done. I had muted him and not realized that. And so he quote tweeted me. And then, so that's where the
it must be where mine are coming from too, because I had this influx right after you blocked the guy with the pink account. Oh my God, this huge influx came my way after that. So he must have shared a couple of comments because boy, oh boy, I'm just getting hell from all sides. But personally, I would have cut Bryce on the spot. But what I'm saying is there any level of punishment that would be acceptable that might quell the masses a little bit? Do you think? This is opinion only.
My opinion. I don't know. The people that want some penalty, some punishment of them, I don't know what the sort of punishment would be acceptable to them. I just go up personally. Personally, my position is the UFC should not have the power to punish people about over speech, but they do have the power to say, we do not want to be in business with someone that says something that's so offensive, so outrageous. So, it does not, you don't have to go say, it shouldn't take you to come out his comments to make people realize that Hitler was a bad dude.
Yeah.
That there is something terrible about Hitler. And, and his comments are that vile. And again, people throw the word vile and outrageous and stuff around sometimes, too much, because some things are just, offensive. But this is truly a vile statement. And I just do not, do you want to be in business with someone that holds these beliefs that is going to tarnish your brand so badly?
Somebody said something it interested me. They said, if this had been WWE, that person would have been out the door. But it's different for UFC because UFC is trying not to appeal to the masses. They're trying to appeal to like a specific crowd, whereas WWE is trying to just go worldwide and be more mainstream. Basically, they boiled it down to WWE wants to be mainstream, and now UFC does not want to be mainstream. What do you think of that?
I guess my impression would be WWE wants to be a little more family friendly, like hits all the quadrants. And, no one wants their kids watching something where a guy's praising Hitler.
Yeah. What happened to the UFC's code of conduct?
Well, that's what I was alluding to earlier. They got this code of conduct that they had passed, and it supposedly gives the UFC the right to punish people for making comments. It says they can suspend you, it can fine you, all these things. And what has happened, and supposedly, according to Ant Evans, who used to work at the UFC, is after the antitrust lawsuit was filed, they stopped enforcing the code of conduct. And he links to that. I don't think it had to do with the antitrust lawsuit, because the antitrust lawsuit has really, and I'll get to the concern I think they had. I'll say that first. I think their concern of enforcing the code of conduct was that made them look more like employers, right? And I think what happened is after the antitrust lawsuit was filed, they realized, we are susceptible to a bunch of other charges, and one of them is treating fighters like employees. And since that date, and I don't think it's a coincidence, since they filed that antitrust lawsuit shortly after that, since Endeavor bought them, and then briefly after that, Leslie Smith filed her NLRB complaint, all coming together that they were employees. You notice they stopped completely enforcing the code of conduct, except during fight week, when they could just take away your bonus from the outfitter kit. But all the other comments they stopped enforcing. And I think what has happened is they haven't come out and said it, but I think the reason they don't enforce it here with Bryce, why they didn't enforce it with other fighters, why they basically thrown out any enforcement, is they've decided, listen, that is evidence under the probably under the previous administration, and definitely under the Biden administration it would have been, but under the Trump administration before that and Obama, this was a type of evidence that could be used against us, that these are employees. So let's stop doing this, because this could get us in trouble if anybody wanted to examine their employment status. And so I think that's why they abandoned it. Now people say, well, it also happened when they shifted to the right. I think that it's a coincidence that happened at the same time, because they realized they could appeal to the right, and it goes hand in hand, declare that you're, completely free for free speech. But I think the evidence to me suggests that when the timing is almost too much of a coincidence when it happened, that suggests to me that they decided that we are no longer going to enforce this, because we are worried that people will use it as evidence that they have employee status. And I think that's the real reason why Bryce and all these other fighters have been left to Sean Strickland, all these guys saying stuff, why they've been left to say whatever they want.
That brings me back to Dana's response. What did you think of that when you heard how it started, which was great? And then the questions coming in, which were like, free speech, nothing to see here.
Well, again, I think the free speech, they had to make a statement because they can't be like silently endorsing the comment that Hitler's great. Again, they pointed out Hitler killed 6 million Jews. Hitler not only did kill, he tried to wipe out the Jewish people of Europe. And we can even add the crimes. They didn't even get into all of them. He tried to wipe out the Roma people of Europe and killed up to 1 million of them. He tried to wipe out the vast majority of Russians, Poles, and other Eastern ethnic groups. And the ones that were going to be alive, the small minority, 10% or 20% of that population would have been enslaved. So his plan, what he did was awful, killed millions, and his plans were even worse, as impossible as that sounds. And so he's a bad dude. There's no getting around that. And I think they did a good job of pointing out how stupid his comments are. And I think that's why they came out, so harsh on Bryce, because again, they can't can him for those comments because he was said outside the UFC, because I think their real concern is we've decided that as much as we claim it's because we are free speech absolutists, the real thing is we do not want to get in the position of enforcing speech, enforcing our code of conduct outside the UFC walls, because then we can get into further trouble down the road.
What about with this administration change, though? Wouldn't that give them a false sense of confidence? Or not even a false sense of confidence, a sense of confidence. Nothing false about it. They're firmly in bed with this administration.
I'm sure they feel a little safer, but there's always the chance that, someone in the administration rules against them. Listen, you can only push your luck so far, even with Trump in office. It's not like they can get away with anything. There's at some point people are going to look like, why it's going to be bad politics for Trump to let the UFC do whatever they want. So that's one. Two, they have to be worried about the next administration, and they don't want this evidence lined up upon them that you've been treating the fighters this way for years now. Obviously they have employee status, because you can't suddenly turn it off and on how you treat the fighters.
Do you think that UFC sponsors, should the UFC be concerned about sponsors possibly abandoning ship?
I think this is a real concern. If the UFC becomes known as the sport of Bryce Mitchells and Jake Shields and all these other people saying, whatever Sean Strickland's saying that's crazy, and all these other, Conor McGregor, just a long list of fighters right now that have bad PR for the UFC becomes known as that. There eventually, the social norms have pivoted in this country. We become much more, I don't want to say, we're not really like right wing and conservative the way we used to in the past. We're much more of a contrarian society that lets anything go, but that can pivot on a dime. And so the UFC, I think, is concerned that there will be mainstream sponsors, broadcasters, whatever, that go, listen, we do not want to be tied down to a promotion that is linked so heavily, not just in the conservative politics, but so heavily into far right extremism.
Do you think there will ever be a point that the UFC is going to punish, and by punish, I don't want it to sound like punishment, but cut ties. I guess that's the better term here. Do you think that there's ever going to be a point where they just cut these fighters loose?
They did in the past, and I think at some point when the social norms and the country's culture changes again, or doesn't even have to change a lot, just slightly pivots, they might do it again. There's also the point too, when these fighters start hurting their bottom line, if they start losing sponsors, if they start running into other problems. Right now, Trump, and the Republicans own all the, own the White House, they own the Congress, they own the Supreme Court. It's, they are in bed with allies that run government. But come midterms, let's see what happens. And they do not want to be facing, and they do not want to making enemies of political opponents that can go after them. They don't also want to make enemies or offend other members of the conservative movement, that when the mega-ism disappears, that they can come back and go after the UFC. So I think eventually there is a chance they can take action. They'll probably take action that I wouldn't agree with, instead of saying, listen, we just don't want to do business with you. they'll take the action I would hate, which is like, we're going to suspend you for a long time and not let you go anywhere else because, as much as we hate what you say, we hate the possibility of you fighting somewhere else even worse.
All right. So that's going to wrap up Bryce Mitchell talk for right now. Let's talk about Luke Thomas's video. He talked about things that promotions in the past had problems with and why they weren't viable and why basically no promotion is going to be able to compete with the UFC. Was there a common thread, though, that connected all of these failed promotions?
Well, yeah, the common thread is they have no opportunity with the UFC there, that there's no chance for success with the UFC there. I should note that this starts after the death of Pride. If you go from that point on, after Pride is gone, there's almost no chance for another promotion. And his point was, and people that listen to this podcast and people that have read my stuff for the years and watched my other videos, like why is UFC the monopoly, or, going back well over 10 years now, will probably recognize a lot of the arguments Luke's makes. And that's why I like the video so much, because it's very similar to the arguments I make. And it's nice that, that he will that's his arguments now. I'm happy for that because more people will see these arguments. And so, but the reason that promotions cannot, the common through line, the common thread is that the reason that promotions cannot compete with the UFC isn't because they're run by dumb people, which is often the case. Isn't the fact that, that the UFC is uniquely run by geniuses that no one can compete with. You could believe that, but they might be really good promoters, but they're not so uniquely special at what they do that no one can compete with them. The reason they can't compete is because the way the marketplace and MMA has been set up, that the UFC has dominated it so much amongst the key assets necessary to compete, that no promotion, no matter how well run, no matter how smart they do, no matter how financially backed they are, they cannot acquire those assets to compete with the UFC. That's the through line right there.
How close to being a truly successful promotion did Strikeforce get? Because they had a lot of ranked talent too.
Well, this is an interesting thing because Strikeforce was probably the last gasp of someone that had a chance to carve out a spot in the market. They were not competing with the UFC. They were not on the level of the UFC. They were not another Pride. People got to remember, until 2006, Pride was the superior promotion in everybody's eye. 2006, the UFC takes off with their pay-per-view sales, and Pride runs into trouble with Fuji TV because of their, Yakuza connections, organized crime. They fall down. UFC rises above them. But that was the only one. Since then, no one has really come to challenge UFC except Strikeforce was the closest of someone getting to that point where they had escape velocity to not be on the level of the UFC, but to actually carve out a market and compete somewhat with UFC. And we had Steven Espinoza on here. He talked about how great they were in some ways. I did a whole piece on Strikeforce. I've talked to people at Showtime at the time. And Strikeforce, well, first I'll say, people say Strikeforce, they ran themselves in the ground. They paid too much. Strikeforce had lost money investing in the promotion, but they were a viable promotion. They were a promotion looking to be profitable. They were a promotion on a path to profitability. In fact, they were profitable often. It was, the investment level that they put money in, they were sunk, but they were kind of like where UFC was before the complete tough takeout, where it took off, but they were moving in a direction, the right direction. There was, if you looked at their finances, you're not like this company has to sell, they're doomed. You're looking at going, the trajectory is going in the right way. But they sold partly because, as Scott Coker said in the deposition, he hinted at, one of them was his partners wanted to get out because they made an offer and they knew that they would, when the offer was made, that we would walk away with guaranteed profit if we took this offer. Two is the UFC supposedly kind of threatened them or hinted at that we will go after your fighters, drive up the cost so much so you can't compete. And the other thing is that Showtime made the mistake of thinking the Strikeforce didn't have any options, and they kind of played hardball with them. And as people at Showtime told me, the big mistake they made at the time is what they should have done, and what they often did with like boxing promotions, is they should have just gone back, renegotiated, and given them more money to begin with, so they could compete more in the space. But since they thought Strikeforce had nowhere else to go, and they were dependent on Showtime, they thought, well, we can play this as long as we want and not up the offer to them until, unfortunately, at that point, UFC bought them. And the UFC acquired them. Some theories, and this is strong, is because the Grand Prix and Strikeforce looked like they potentially could get on pay-per-view. And pay-per-view, successful pay-per-views was exclusively for the UFC. They didn't want anybody challenging them there. And the other very strong likelihood is because the UFC knew they were going to leave Spike. No one else knew that, but they knew they're going to leave Spike. And they bought Strikeforce as a defensive acquisition to prevent Spike from giving them a spot after the UFC left. And that's why Bellator got that big deal, because there was no one else available to put on Spike.
Wow. And the part about UFC knowing they were going to leave Spike before anybody else did, and they bought Strikeforce defensively, that's the part that sticks right there. What about WEC? I know I didn't put that in our outline. For those out there listening, we always operate from an outline. But what about WEC? Because they seem to be headed in the right direction too. Why did UFC snap them up so quick?
Well, I mean, we got to remember, WC was not the home. They had some. They had Uriah Faber and some other lightweight, I should say, when I say lightweight, below lightweight, featherweight, bantamweight fighters. But, I mean, the reasoning often given for why they acquired WC is they acquired them and parked them on, at the time, was the Outdoor Network, because I think it was the Outdoor Network at the time, then became Versus later. They could have had another name to begin with. But they parked them there because that channel was thinking of getting into MMA, and they wanted to make sure there was not an opening for any other promotion to be on that network. That's the story always said. And so WEC was a successful regional promotion in California, but it wasn't really like it was truly threatening the UFC. What it did, though, is it let the UFC hire this other promotion and park them on a network because their contract with Spike prevented the UFC from being on multiple networks. And so they had to be with Spike only, and they were like, well, we don't want to leave this network open for any other potential future rival competition. We will buy a promotion and park them there, and then we'll use that to acquire all the best featherweights and welterweights, so we have them all under one roof in our promotion instead of somewhere else.
Remember, WEC had Carlos Condit, Uriah Faber, Dominic Cruz. They had Miguel Torres. They had Chad Mendez. They had Joe Benavidez. I mean, they had all the talent. And remember, wasn't it WEC that had Chael Sonnen and Paul Harris?
Yeah, well, they had Filo.
Yeah,
I don't know about Harris, but they had Paulo
Filio. That's right.
Who did the whole thing where he talked to himself during a fight, had a mental health breakdown in the middle of it, but also Chael blew his fight with him, and he was actually rated as one of the top two, just I think number 2 at middleweight for a while behind Anderson Silva. But one thing they did too is UFC, when they acquired WFA, remember that promotion?
Yes.
In fact, we talked about that. It was as part of the antitrust case. They talked about it. How one of the reasons they acquired the WFA, the UFC supposedly did, is one is the UFC was worried about them running shows in Vegas. They didn't want competition in Vegas because the WFA had people with connections in Vegas. And the other thing is they didn't want anybody else acquiring the WFA roster, because a part of the roster was people, like you said, had Machida was on the roster, Uriah Faber, but the big one was Rampage was on that roster.
That's right.
And Rampage held a win over Chuck Liddell. And so they're like, we need to acquire them so we can put Chuck versus Rampage, because no one then could claim that we have the fighter that beat Chuck Liddell, who was our light heavyweight champion, our big ATM at the time. And so but when they acquired WFA, they took a lot of those fighters, put them in the WEC, and then took the WEC and parked it on Outdoor Network. So that's the story of the WEC. But the big thing for the UFC, for competition wise, is Pride was the, I guess you would say, the equivalent, their true rival, equal or superior sometimes in fans and the media's eyes. And Strikeforce, while not not at the level of the UFC, had a large enough roster of top fighters, especially, Bader Emelianenko, the number 1 heavyweight in the world, and a lot of the lightweights, because when Pride went under, a lot of the best lightweights didn't go to the UFC. They went to Dream in Japan and ended up signing with Strikeforce as well. And there's cross-pollination. So a lot of the best lightweights, they had fighters in several weight classes that could challenge as the top fighters in the world to the UFC. And at the time, UFC had like 2/3 of the top fighters in the top 10 in each weight class, and Strikeforce had like 1/6. And so there was, again, that's a vast control by the UFC, but that's less than like the 85% of the top 10 they have now.
Back to Rampage for a second with the WFA. Wasn't it that Pride was loaning out some of their fighters on that? Not really loaning them out, but giving the fighters an opportunity to go out and fight somewhere else. Because didn't Rampage come over with the Pride acquisition?
Well, he didn't come over with Pride. He left Pride and signed with the WFA because he'd lost from Pride to Vanderlei Silva. The people Pride was at the time, though, loaning out in 2006 was to Strikeforce. They sent over Overeem
That's right.
to Strikeforce. And also, I can't remember, it was Overeem was one, and then there's another fighter as well. But Overeem came over and fought, I believe, Paul Buntello.
Yep. Let's talk Pride for a second. And being a victim to the UFC's massive purchase power. You alluded to the Yakuza earlier. Can you break down Pride for us in full? To access the bonus content of this episode, you must be a paid subscriber. To do that, go to heynottheface.substack.com and subscribe today.
Ow! Ow! Not the face! Ooh! Ooh! Okay, the face!